This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 192 of the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. The writing process comes with internal resistance, even for strong writers. Most people who say they enjoy writing don't enjoy the entire process, particularly the getting started part. This is why writing is a common challenge when executive functioning is impacted. Layer on issues with background knowledge, language, and decoding, and it becomes even more complex. Kids need the puzzle pieces that fit together to support writing, things like vocabulary, syntax, the ability to decode words, and the ability to spell. But while we're working on these foundational skills, we also need to make sure kids get support with the glue that holds them together. This is where self-regulated strategy development can be really powerful. Self-regulated strategy development, or SRSD, is a metacognitive strategy designed to help students with the planning and execution of challenging academic tasks like writing. That's why I invited Dr. Nellie Kakady to episode 192 of Facto Leaders podcast to talk about her research and work in the field with SRSD and supporting students with learning differences. Dr. Nellie Kakady is an educational therapist and psychology professor dedicated to creating a more accessible world, one classroom at a time. She has spent the last 12 years as a teacher, learning specialist, and researcher designing academic programs to support all types of learners. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and child learning and development from the University of Texas at Dallas, a master's degree in psychology from Texas A&M University Commerce, and a doctorate in educational psychology with an emphasis in special education from A&M Commerce. Her current work is twofold. She is a learning specialist at an independent school where she provides academic support to high school students, and she is a professor at a community college where she teaches courses in psychology. In this conversation, we discuss why so many writing challenges are tied to executive functioning, the power of micro-commitments and working through the struggle, scaffolding, fading prompts, and giving just enough support. We start writing before we start writing, and why starting with 5 minutes is okay. Why self-talk is for strategy and self-image, and that we need to model and explicitly teach both. Before we get going, I wanted to remind you to take a look at the School of Clinical Leadership if you are a related service provider or educational professional who wants to provide executive functioning support for students in schools. When we're thinking about executive functioning support, especially in the area of writing, we need to make sure that we're thinking about support across all tiers 1, 2, 3, and those students who need intensive supports in special education. Really, it needs to be a team effort, but if you are in that related service provider role and you're providing those intensive interventions, you can be the catalyst on your team that gets some of those initiatives in place. It starts with understanding direct intervention, the internal executive functioning skills and how they present externally, and how we can think about using multiple service delivery models to make sure that kids get support across their day. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Nellie Kakady. Today I am joined by Dr. Nellie Kakady. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk with you this morning. I thought, why don't we just start off with having you share who you are and what you do, just a little bit of your history leading up to what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me. I know we've tried to have this conversation for a while, and I really appreciate it. I am a mom of three, and that's a part of why this scheduling this took a minute because I had the first time we touched base, it was like right after I had my third baby. And now he's a little over one. But I lead with that because being a mom and a parent, really motivates everything that I do and impacts everything that I do. But I'm incredibly passionate about making education and learning accessible to all people, regardless of background or learning difference or anything like that. So I started my career as a teacher and worked in literacy intervention after that for a nonprofit. And based on my experiences there, I was really interested in how to create programs that would really reach all kinds of learners. And so from there, I went to grad school and I was interested in academic intervention. And so my research was around academic intervention, specifically in writing and figuring out how to help kids become confident writers. And from there, I realized that working in writing was partly about writing, but it was very much more about executive functioning. Like that was
Mhm.
the underlying
Yeah.
um, concern really was, it's not that kids are struggling necessarily to generate ideas, it's that they're struggling to self-regulate or monitor their attention or even, have positive self-talk to get through a writing assignment. So
Hmm.
I focused in on a specific instructional framework while I was in grad school called self-regulated strategy development. We can talk more about what that actually
Yeah.
means later. And so I did that and I did intervention research. So I would go into schools and implement writing interventions for kids and saw a lot of progress there. And then after grad school, worked in an independent school as a learning specialist. And I'm at a new school now doing similar work, but for high school students, a lot of executive functioning support, one-on-one. And then I also teach college classes at a local community college. And then on the side, and my goal is to ultimately make this my full-time work is I've started to offer like comprehensive educational evaluations for students who otherwise wouldn't be able to get the services through schools. I'm in the Dallas area, and we
Okay.
have a huge problem with like wait time for kids to get evaluations or services. And so often families will have to go through like private services, and it just takes so long and it's so
Mhm.
expensive. So I've really
Yeah.
been trying to figure out how I can help support families in that area in a way that's much more cost effective and can really decrease the wait time because that's been a huge problem. So that's where I am now. And
Yeah.
my hope also is that it'll allow me more flexibility to be with my young children. So that's a part of it too.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a past episode that I did on the topic of the evaluations and working with the schools and like whether you go private or whether you try to work with the schools. And I know that's some people do a combination when they go into private practice or start doing consulting. But previous guest, it was Ebony Green, who she does helps SLPs get school contracts. And so what that's allowed her to do is work with the schools so that it's like the families are getting the services at the schools. So that's definitely an interesting option to consider, especially when you're working in like with the rural areas, for example. A lot of times they have a hard time finding specialists like the psychologists and the OTs and the speech pathologists and people to do those thorough evaluations. I know that's one of the biggest pain points with a lot of the people that might be listening is that they like you have to evaluate using the tools that you have at your disposal and the team that you have at your disposal. And if you need multiple people to be doing that evaluation or like some specific specialist or like some specific protocol, it makes it really hard to get a good plan to make sure that you know that you're doing the right, like offering the right programming. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's there's definitely a lot of work that could be done in that area. So I'm glad to hear you're doing that. So yeah.
Thanks. I think what really hurts my heart too is I've had parents reach out like through Instagram and other things and just say, I know that there's something more going on with my
Yeah.
kid, but the school is just not able to help me. Or like I know
Yeah.
that there's something, but I have no way of moving forward. And that's awful. And no
I
one should
know.
do that.
And the thing is, like everybody that I've talked to with the schools, I think even people in leadership, I think they know, it's not like they're completely unaware. I've maybe only met a couple administrators that really were like closed off, but
Mm,
it's so overwhelming and they have so many different things that they're thinking about. And yeah, it's a lot. And I think a lot of parents do have that level of understanding, but it's still hard because they're trying to figure out where do I go to help my kid? And I mean, I get parents that reach out to me all the time that are like, the school is not addressing the needs of my child. And like what you're saying sounds exactly like my kid, and this is when I'm
mhm,
talking about executive functioning, they're like, you're describing my son or my daughter to a T. But
mm,
where can I find somebody who actually understands executive functioning? And that's my challenge as well, because I work a lot with the professionals to educate them in this area in language and cognition and executive functioning. But I also have parents who are looking for help for their kids. And so I'm always like, where do you send them? Because especially with like geography and licensure laws, you want to make sure that they get a good evaluation because there's so many people who market themselves online as executive functioning coaches. And I'm like,
mm,
I totally appreciate that people are trying to help and like, I don't think that there's one discipline that is like, this is the kind of person that has to be working on executive functioning. It can go across so many different disciplines. Um, but there's also some people where I'm like, I know that you don't really understand executive functioning based on the way that you're explaining it. So I'm
yeah.
always mindful of who I'm sending parents to. So
Me too. Me too. Because I think I've had situations where parents said, "Well, I've got this executive function coach," and I look into them, and they're essentially like a homework buddy,
yeah,
like coming to make sure that the kid like
I
sits.
know.
I'm like, no, that's not the same thing. Like, and that has its place. It does. It's not
Right.
as tutors or any other kind of support, but that's not addressing the root cause of the learning challenges. And I think that's where you and I like share that passion of like we have to get to the root of it in order to see that homework is getting completed, in order to see those changes, but we're not going to get there until we really focus in on what the actual cause is.
Right. Yeah. And I actually had a conversation the other day about that where it's like, if you're an academic coach versus an executive functioning coach, or are you both? Or do you brand yourself as one or the other, but you work on both? Like that
Yeah.
whole conversation, because I mean, maybe you could be a really good tutoring company that specifically helps people with academics, and executive functioning is one thing that you work on in your wheelhouse, but you're
Mhm.
focusing on academics. And that's like, if parents want help with the other things, the other areas of life that could be impacted by executive functioning, maybe that wouldn't be the person that you would go to. You would just go to them for the academic support. So, yeah, lots of stuff. Definitely don't envy the parents trying to like be case managers for their kids, essentially.
Yeah, it's hard.
So, I wanted to talk about like, I guess a place where we could start. And I know that when we talked before, we realized that we both touched on self-regulated strategy development in our doctoral work. Now, I briefly touched on it because I was focusing on metacognition and language. And you really went in and that was the core strategy that you were studying, because I was kind of more focused on can we use this to elicit language and just descriptive, semantic feature analysis and description. Like we know that we can use some of these cognitive strategies. And so I kind of touched on it, but it's really about giving kids a strategy. Well, not kids, really anybody, a strategy for writing. So Can you define what self-regulated strategy development is? I think that would be a good place to start.
Sure. So self-regulated strategy development, or SRSD, I'll start referring it to that.
Yeah.
So it's an instructional approach designed to teach students self-regulation strategies alongside a specific writing strategy. So what that looks like is like the framework itself has like six stages or six
Hmm.
steps. And so the first one is just to develop background knowledge on whatever the topic is, which, most teachers are already doing that anytime they're teaching
Hmm.
writing. And that can be done if just like brainstorming, like whole class discussion, that kind of thing. So it's just teaching the foundational skills you would need for the strategy. So it's developing background knowledge. And then, so a lot of the times SRSD frameworks are used to teach persuasive writing. So explaining
Hmm.
like what is, how do you take a stand, things like that. And then that's also when you would teach is often an acronym, and like what
Hmm.
each part of the acronym stands for, like how to use them. So that's the first stage. Then you discuss it. So you explain like why students would ever want to do this.
Yeah.
Like why it's beneficial, like this will help you remember like the parts of a paper, makes it a lot easier. This is also when we used a lot of graphic organizers, a
Hmm.
lot of visuals to help it really become clear. And then the third stage is to model it. So I used a lot of like practice essays. I would show them how it works. And then we would do the fourth stage is to memorize it. So we would do activities to make sure that they memorize the actual steps. Okay, like so one that I used often was POW tree. And
Hmm.
that's
Oh yeah.
like pick an idea. Yeah.
Yeah,
Organize.
I was gonna say Pow and Tree were the ones that I always saw come up. So you used those two together in the same strategy, not separately, because I've seen them be used separately too.
Yeah, you can.
Hmm.
And I for persuasive stuff, I've combined the two. And so like we would have graphic organizers, like we would like create a tree and like draw the different branches and like label it with the different parts. But it was, pick an idea, organize your notes, write and say more, which so that enough could be on its own. You could
Right.
just some
Yeah,
power.
like sufficient for some
Hmm.
people. Hmm.
Yes. And
And
then
what
to
does
make
tree
it
stand for?
so that was to make it more persuasive. So it was like topic sentence. R was reason. So you needed like three
Hmm.
reasons and then an explanation, which is like their analysis. And then the E was ending. So I use this a lot when I would work with older students after they had a good understanding of
Hmm.
the POW piece of it. So they make sure they memorize it. Then the fifth stage was to support it. So scaffolding, making sure that they could complete parts of the writing with prompts. And then the last part was just independent practice. So they would practice the writing itself. So that SRC is just a way of teaching writing. But in all of these pieces, though, we would have like a positive um, self-statement like sheet where they would write
Mm,
out
I
statements
love
as they
that.
were writing to
Hmm.
like I can do this, or when I'm frustrated, like here are some strategies I can use, because it was frustrating. And the goal was to have them learn how to talk through those frustrations.
Hmm.
um, and so that was one component of how to self-regulate. Like those things also had to be explicitly taught. And then the other pieces of executive functioning, the planning and the organizing, that was very much we were doing that a lot through the graphic organizers and having one thing that I also liked was it's very systematic. So each of these components, it would just be like a short lesson each day. So it wasn't like every day we're going to be writing a full paper. Like that was very overwhelming for
Hmm.
kids. And so we would try in teaching each of these parts to like turn it into a game, or having them walk around and like label the parts of an essay and things like that. So that's a little bit about SRSD and like what it can look like.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
So, yeah, thanks for explaining all that. And so, what I liked about what you said was so, one, it sounds like it can go really well with a lot of other frameworks that people might be familiar with. Like what you just described there could go along with the Archer and Hughes explicit instruction, I do, we do, you do, which is really, I think, it's really powerful because you can do that for anything. Like you could do that when you're writing, you could do that when you're teaching somebody to tie their shoes or clean their room or so that is a good one that is accessible and I think it makes sense. And I think that people sometimes have a hard time, especially when executive functioning is impacted, knowing how to give the right amount of help that kids aren't so frustrated that they give up and you're literally just like asking them to do something over and over again that they can't do and maybe they're getting in trouble because they can't do it and it's like you can't punish someone because they don't have the skill to do the thing or well people do that unfortunately but like it's not it won't help you can't reward someone into doing something if you don't teach the skills but then at the same time I think sometimes people will go too far in the other direction particularly with writing where you provide so much support without giving a strategy and fading back that prompting that then you're like doing the internal processing for kids. And I see that all the time with writing, especially when you get parent volunteers and teaching assistants who are just like have such good intentions and want to help kids and can be such a great resource, but they need a strategy like this to know how exactly do I provide enough support, but not too much help. So
That's a great point. And the way I think of it too is often we act as kids executive functioning.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Like all the time.
Right. I
And we're
know.
like robbing them of the skills. Like I know, and I get it as a mom, like I get the urge to want to help and we think that we're helping. But sometimes like the help is in the struggle itself, is
I
in
know. Uh-huh.
and it can be hard and it can be painful. But it is a part of the process and it doesn't mean parents or teachers never intervene. That's not the goal. But I think we also have to normalize like a little bit of struggle is okay. And
Oh, I know. We
yeah.
so have to normalize that. I mean, I think, yeah, that could be a whole separate podcast
Yeah.
topic.
Part two of
Um,
this conversation.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I know it's hard, and I think that it's parents who are probably need to do some scaffolding for some of those daily
Mhm.
activities, but then it happens at school as well, because sometimes those daily things, I mean, if you're in a kindergarten class, you're talking about tying your shoes and like packing your bags and all that stuff. But then also it's the more specific academic things. I actually have a strategy where it's like a combination of, the strategic planning and how do you model self-talk and give kids a framework, but it could go really well with something like SRSD and you could layer it in. But I like what you said about how you have to model positive self-talk. So self-talk is about the strategic planning. It's also about the resilience and having self-talk about yourself to be able to work through something that's challenging. Is that something that in SRSD frameworks is like part of the intervention? Is that something that you added because you realized it was important?
It is part of the process. I can't take credit for that. It is in
Okay, I was just curious
process.
because
Yeah, because it is so important. Because it's especially for students for whom writing is difficult. So much of it comes in, this is hard. I'm not good enough. I don't want to do this. And
yeah,
it because it involves so many executive functioning skills, like sitting in your chair for a long period of time, or
right.
fine motor skills that could be, difficult. Like I have to hold this pencil and I have to fill out these, like it's a lot. And so we definitely spend time explicitly teaching, what could those positive self-statements sound like. We have the sheet like on your desk, like while you're working through this to remind yourself of how to push through. And we do also a lot of goal setting. Today the goal is just to write like two sentences or whatever it may be, but they set
Hmm.
that goal at the
Yeah.
beginning too, so that they can slowly learn to do that with other academic tasks.
Hmm. Yeah. Writing is just such a beast I mean, it is for even people who like to write and are good writers. Like I love writing and um, it's such a rewarding thing. And it's so like it's so amazing to look back at something you've written and be like, I put so much work into this and I'm really proud of it. But the getting started part is, I mean, it's hard for everybody. I mean, that's why there's like the Stephen Pressfields and the Anne Lamott's. Have you read either of their books?
No.
So Stephen Pressfield is that's a common one among creatives. Anybody who's doing any kind of creative work, particularly writing, but he talks about it's the war of art. He talks about the resistance and like, it's like all about basically it's self-talk, the entire book, like his internal struggle of trying to sit down and write. And then Anne Lamott's is Bird by Bird. That's another one that's like a common, I think anybody who's done a lot of writing is familiar with both of those people. I think the other one that I really liked, it was Paulo Coelho. Are you familiar with
Mhm.
him, that wrote The Alchemist? But he had this episode on Tim Ferriss's
Mhm.
podcast. It's like just him for the whole episode, and he's like, before I write, I have to suffer. Like I have to struggle and procrastinate and not write, and then I start writing and I can't stop. And I don't know that everybody has that experience. Like I don't know that everybody can get into a flow like that. I think for some kids it's like the whole time is you got to figure out how to sit here and maybe take a break and then come back. And so I don't know. I mean, how is it for you? I mean, you've done a dissertation and done a lot of writing. Like, what's your process like for working through some of those things?
Um, I can relate to the have to suffer first.
Yeah.
Like it's
Some
very
people
much.
have to clean their house or like something like that. I don't
Yeah.
know. I've got to ease into it.
I feel like what brain science kind of will tell us too is like our brains don't like to get started on things, and so
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but we can manage things that like maybe we start just a little and our brains have an easier time like going back to it rather than like starting something completely new. And
Mhm.
so I think for me, like a blank page can really psych me out, like just with
Yeah.
nothingness. I'm
Mhm.
like, oh, this just seems like it's endless and there's nothing that I can, I have nothing to say. But if I can just jot down a few ideas, that usually helps. I'm like, okay, well, there's something here. Um, and then of course, like I take breaks and I would listen to music, but you're
Mhm.
right. There is such a sense of satisfaction looking back on something that you wrote and that you worked really hard on. And so I try to remind kids of that, which they can't always see. They can't
I
always see what the
know.
result will look like. And I'm like, oh,
Right. Well, that's the executive functioning.
exactly, exactly. And we help them visualize like what the end result will look like, and how do we in baby steps get there. And I have to do that for myself. I'm like, how am I going to feel? And we help kids with that too. Is like, what is it going to feel like when you're done? How, and having them like name those emotions. Like, I'm going to feel really proud. I'm going to feel excited because I'm done with this thing. I'm like, "Well, it's
Yeah.
finally over. I'm going to be happy that I'm going to, get a good grade, or my parents will be excited." So trying to help them visualize also what the end result looks like is something that helps me personally and is an important skill for kids to learn also.
I like how you talked about, talking about the how you're going to feel in context, because I think a lot of times people think, oh, well, if somebody has, a behavior problem, they need to go talk about their feelings and process that. But like that's out of the context. And a lot of times there's no generalization. And there you're
Mhm.
giving a specific time when it's relevant to think about the vocabulary aspect and like a tying it to a specific experience when it would be relevant. I think that distinction is really important because it is useful to be able to articulate those things, but it's not useful if you're talking about it in this isolated context when it's not like they're not going to really know and make that connection. I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers design programming and interventions to support students' executive functioning in school settings. Social skills groups are often seen as the entire intervention, and when they're delivered this way, they're often done in an academic format where an adult is leading the session and kids are answering questions or discussing various social rules and scenarios. This is a very small piece of what needs to happen. When we think of social skills intervention as just a lesson plan or social skills group, kids get really good at answering questions about how they should be acting in hypothetical situations. However, they often don't transfer any of those things over to real life. This is because real social interactions are not academic situations. We're actually not working on the skills preventing kids from using the information and knowledge we're trying to give them. In other words, we're not building the executive functioning skills kids need to be successful in social situations, not to mention other areas of life. Before you can successfully implement social skills intervention, you need to have a solid understanding of what executive functioning is, both the internal skills and the external behaviors, what successful intervention looks like and who needs to be involved, and what service delivery models can effectively address executive functioning. This is exactly what I show you how to do in the School of Clinical Leadership. In the program, you'll learn why kids continue to experience anxiety or behavioral challenges, even though they're going to therapy or have a behavior plan, common mistakes multidisciplinary teams make when teaching executive functioning, and how to correct these mistakes, why kids struggle with problem solving and friendships, even though they're going to pull out therapy and social skills groups, and most importantly, how to help your team work together to figure out solutions to all of these things. If you are in a related service provider role, if you're a speech pathologist, social worker, counselor, psychologist, occupational therapist, or other professional on a school team supporting students, you can emerge into a leadership role on your team and help to guide these interventions. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. How do you, when you're helping kids visualize specifically for writing, if they can't quite come up with it on their own, or like visualizing the end goal of writing or visualizing the steps to get there so that they can get started and start to create some of those mental images about writing that they can maybe start to use more independently?
I think that's a good question, because for some students, it's never happened before. Like, they have never
Yeah,
finished a writing
right.
assignment. And so I think, honestly, I have had, we, in teaching like an instructional framework, we use a lot of like sample essays and show them examples. And even then, I will say that sometimes people are like, well, I could never write that, or like, that's just too
Yeah.
much. And so I've showed them essays from like previous students who were, starting out with like 1 to 2 sentences and ended up writing like 5 or 6, and having time to really think through, like, our end result looks different for each of us.
Mm-hmm.
So we try to tie it to the goal setting piece. It's like, okay, right now you're writing 1 sentence. Like, 3 can be a great goal, and that is still so much farther than where you are. So helping them understand that it is an individual process first, and then using actual pictures. I mean, even
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
pictures of like things that other students have written, like, so they could see it in like a kid's handwriting, pictures of um what even the emotions look like pictures of a kid who is happy, a picture of a kid who looks proud. And we talk about, like, how do you think that person feels? Like, can you imagine, like, when is a time that you've ever felt like that? And if they say like, I've never felt like that, then we talk about how, like, this is a really important way for them to an important experience for them to have, so that they can like feel that, what
Mm-hmm.
that feels like.
Yeah.
But I have never had a student who said I mean, maybe, yes, they've never been proud of their writing, but they can find something that they've been proud of. Like, I was so proud that, like, I won this race, or that I was able
Mm-hmm.
to do this. And sometimes you need help getting there, getting to something like that. But we try to make it very real, and connect it to emotion that they have experienced before, so they know that like what that feels like. And then, like, even using visuals, sometimes we would print those pictures and have it on their desk as a part of their like
Mm-hmm.
positive self-statements of, like, this is what I'm working toward. And I think that for some students, I mean, we always try to focus on the positive emotions, but for some, their default is to just avoid
Yeah.
negative emotions, you know, like I don't
Right.
want to get in
Yep.
trouble or I don't
Hmm.
want to, which is, we try to steer away from that, but it's also very real. I mean, as adults,
Yeah.
we're the same way. Like I want to avoid, I can't submit this late because I want to avoid whatever this negative consequences. Um, so yeah, trying to make it as real as possible through visuals and have them really like think through different times where they have felt some of those emotions.
Yeah. I think that you have to get really creative about tying it to something. Like, yeah, maybe it's not academic, maybe it's something else. Like maybe you're an athlete or maybe you're an artist or um I mean even the littlest thing. So something that I do, like a mental game that I do with myself is like, because I've always been really aware of time and kind of like really like focused on the passage of time. Like just, it's always really fascinated me how time feels when you're doing something you enjoy versus something that you don't enjoy. How it's like, if you for example, are going to go on a vacation and it's like only for the weekend, it feels like those 2 days it doesn't feel like enough time. But if, for example, if I'm going to give a presentation that's like 2 hours and, like it's like, oh my gosh, 2 hours is so long. I'm going to be talking in front of all these people for this whole time. So, but yeah, that's always fascinated me. And honestly, usually when you do a presentation, it flies by anyways, but it's so funny how I like inflate I inflate the time in my head when it's something I'm nervous about or something that I don't want to do. And what I do is sometimes I will focus on the goal of the thing, but then sometimes I focus on like something that I've planned for myself after,
Mhm.
and so that's what I do when I'm like visualizing. And I think that's important too, because you can reward yourself. Like, I think that the way that adults scaffold for themselves is that they embed rewarding activities after things. And they're like, okay, well, I need to get this done because I want to go and do this enjoyable activity. And like, I can't enjoy things if I know that I have things over my head, or like I can, but it's harder. So I don't know. Like, have you ever tried to embed some of those types of things where it's like, okay, yes, you obviously want to make sure that they visualize the end goal of the writing assignment, but what about when it's like, wouldn't it be great to get this, like, get your homework done so that you can, I don't know, like do whatever. Like some kids like to read for pleasure or watch a movie or go outside or whatever. Like, I'm curious if that's worked for you before.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it has. I think, especially now working with a lot of older students, one of the biggest concerns that I hear from them is that like, I've just totally lost track of time because I was scrolling on my phone.
Hmm.
And so we think about ways to use that as a reward with the time limit on
Right.
how
Yeah.
much scrolling can
Hmm.
happen. But it is a power like that is very powerful of having small rewards and for some of them too, like taking a break is the reward, like going
Yeah.
outside, going for a
Hmm.
run. Like I'm gonna go and like walk my dog or go get a snack. Or I had a student who would reward herself with like a Hershey's chocolate like kiss, and then she after a while she's like, "This is probably too much chocolate." So they
Yeah.
like what are some healthy-ish ways to do that? But yes, it is really effective, and it's a lot more digestible for students who have a hard time getting to that longer term goal, because you're right, time is a feeling. And when we talk about spending um, you know, an hour or um, you know, a certain amount of time studying, that can feel very overwhelming. But if you know that you have to write one sentence and that should take, say 10 minutes, that's a lot more digestible um, than the hour of studying or the hour of writing. And so finding ways to help them internalize time and recognize that everyone is in such a different place with that too. There are some students who start that writing process and 20 minutes flies by, and others who are really pushing through to get to 5 minutes. And I think something that parents and educators also have to understand is like, we can't underestimate the power of just 5 minutes. Like even working on something for 5 minutes is still valuable, and you can still build stamina through that. And one way to do that is, like you said, by embedding some of those smaller reward, like smaller goalposts along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things there is one that you can work up a tolerance. And so 5 minutes could turn into 10 minutes, could turn into 20 minutes over time. I think that that is one area where, I mean, definitely parents, I would say, I'm sure the professionals as well, where they get discouraged and give up too soon because you think, what's the point of 5 minutes? But I think that people don't realize that the process of getting ready for 5 minutes of writing is a skill itself. Like that when you're writing, like you start writing before you start writing. Like there's the whole planning and thinking and like, getting yourself ready to write, like doing your this is another Tim Ferriss show quote. Procrastination is part of the process. Not to like encourage avoidance or anything, but some people have things that they'd like to do to get settled. And I think that sometimes you have to just be like, okay, this is my process. And yeah, you don't want to like make it be too long to the extent that you're not getting your things done, but like just accepting that like this is part of the work of getting ready.
Mhm.
And that can be like the settling in, getting yourself a cup of coffee or whatever age appropriate drink kids want to have. Or getting music playing, but then also the planning of writing, like you said, the learning the content and doing the research and all of that. Um, and so like if you're gonna write for 5 minutes, it's obviously condensed, but I think if you get through that and you write for 5 minutes, you've practiced. And just
Mhm.
reiterating that 5 minutes is something, and it's like just to stick with it. So
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's me. Yeah, no, I think that sometimes parents have a hard time realizing like and teachers, I think adults in general have a hard time realizing like they themselves do that. So like why
yeah,
not also allow kids like the ability to do the same? Like do you I don't know anyone who just sits down and like is ready to go right away. Like you wake up and now you've written like 3 pages. I mean, we just don't do that, right? And
yeah.
it's okay to allow kids the same space um, to have their process too, and help. And our job, I think, is to help them figure out what that looks like for them, and
Hmm.
that's okay. Yeah.
Well, and another thing, this is like another mental hack that I do where sometimes you can say, I'm just going to write for 5 minutes. I'm going to commit to doing this for 5 minutes. I think the micro commitments and modeling that to kids is really powerful because and I do this all the time where I'm in the middle of something and it's not that I fully intend on stopping after 5 minutes, but I say, I'm just going to do this for 5 minutes and then I'm going to reevaluate and decide if I want to keep going. And 9 times out of 10, I keep going, but it's chunking, it's making a micro commitment to, I'm just going to do the first paragraph or whatever it is. And then if I feel good and I'm starting to feel warmed up and like things are starting to flow, then I can keep going. So that's another one I think is like if you had your self-talk there for your strategies for your kids, that could be useful as well. I think people don't realize they do that. Where it's like
Yeah.
you make micro commitments all the time. Are you ever excited to write for 3 hours? Or I mean, we're obviously not asking kids to write three for 3 hours
Yeah.
at a time at this point, but
Yeah. I also really like calling it a micro commitment instead of necessarily like a goal that you've set. Because sometimes
right.
even they're like, well, I don't, this is not my real goal or whatever.
Yeah, I
But
know. Like we negotiate with ourselves.
yeah, yeah, and like call it what it is, even for kids. But I like commitment too because you're teaching them to like be a person of your word. Like
Yeah.
try to make a commitment to yourself, and like that in and of itself is so valuable, whether it's about writing or anything else. Being able to like keep a promise to yourself or to anyone else. Um, that's just being a good human. So I like calling labeling it that also, I
Hmm.
think is something I'm going to take away. One of a few things that you've said that I will take away moving forward, is to help label it that way. Like, what commitment are you going to make to yourself uh,
Hmm.
while we're working on this? And when you call it that, like, that just sounds much more like, oh, I do want to make a commitment to myself. I don't want to lie to myself or
Right.
not show up for myself. Um, so I'll be.
Well, and I think just like with the self-image, like I think people don't realize that if you want to do something and you don't follow through, I mean, yeah, it doesn't feel good when you commit to someone else and you don't do what you said you were going to do. Like,
Mhm.
I think there's an obvious impact on your relationships there, which is important for kids to know, but like, how does that make you feel about yourself when you don't keep a commitment to yourself?
Mhm.
And you just like with the self-image, and I mean, I think that's really powerful as well, showing like you can make a commitment to others and it impacts your relationships, but you can make a commitment to yourself too. And it's going to make you feel more confident if you do and if you follow through on your commitment. So like let's figure out a commitment you can follow through on, like again, the micro. But
Mhm.
so why I know that you worked a lot with literacy before, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about your background. What made you specifically decide to focus on writing? And like what kinds of things were coming up for you in your work with literacy and just with students that made you realize that writing was such a big area of need?
So, um, after college, I worked for this literacy nonprofit because I really believed in its mission, and the whole goal was to, help close gaps. And I wanted experience working in schools in a different way outside of just being a classroom teacher. So I thought that was great, and um, I remember being just so excited about this program. And what we would do is we would work one-on-one with students, but we'd also train like volunteers to implement the program as well. But each of us also had to kind of like have our like student we would be really working with and targeting. And so in the process of onboarding students, we were supposed to kind of look for the student we would like to work with one-on-one.
Hmm.
And I remember I found the student. He had moved around a lot, and he was joining. I was at an elementary school, and he was joining in fifth grade. So this was his first and last year there, but his family had moved around so much. And we would do just like an informal sort of reading assessment to see what his grade level was. And he had a first grade reading level as a fifth grader. And it was just the most positive, upbeat kid. And I was like, this is the kid I want to work with. I was so excited. And I remember telling my mentor, and she said, I'm glad that you're so excited about this. But the way the program works is that we're really only looking for kids who are not more than 2.5 years, like quote unquote, behind in reading. And I remember being so confused by that. I'm like, why? Like, why would this doesn't make any sense? I thought the whole goal was to help, close any gaps regardless of where they are. And after, without her saying this explicitly, it turned out to really be tied to money and what they could prove on paper. If you are working with kids who are not that behind, it's easier to show gains than closing a huge gap. And it was all tied to, what we can sort of like prove on paper, which would impact how much money they got, which would impact, in their minds, how many students they could serve. But really along the way, there were some kids who were, you essentially too far behind to even qualify for the program. And that was so frustrating and awful. And luckily, like the mentor I had did not have me like turn the student away. She was like, no, keep working with him.
Hmm.
And if somebody questions it, like she was willing to kind of put herself on the line because
Yeah.
technically we were not supposed to have accepted him into the program. And he made a lot of progress in the end, but no, it wasn't going to be the same as someone who, was already at a third grade reading level. And it's not going to look the same on paper. So from there, I remember being incredibly frustrated, but I continued to work with him. And just we know that there's such a connection between reading and writing. And my motivation to really look into grad school was I wanted to figure out like how to build programs that would be more inclusive, that could make a difference. And so as I started to do research on that, I realized like there's a lot on literacy intervention. There's a lot. And reading
Mm-hmm.
support, maybe the program that, we were using, or the organization I worked for was not the best at, you know, really reaching as many students as possible, regardless of where they were. But there were programs that existed, but there was much less about writing and writing
Mm-hmm.
interventions. And then when I was looking more specifically at students with disabilities and students with emotional and in the literature, it was considered emotional and behavioral disorders. And writing was the area that they struggled in the most. And a lot of the students that I had worked with at the time were labeled as having an emotional disturbance. So I had a connection to, I really wanted to serve that population in particular. And so that's kind of what led me to writing. It was like a long way of getting there, but it was a
Yeah.
frustration I had with a program that made me want to look into how do we build programs that are more inclusive. And then from there, I realized there really wasn't much on writing. And I had always, like you, like I enjoy writing, and I just thought for students who traditionally struggle, or for like the student I had been working with who had moved around so much. I mean, writing is also such an outlet,
Yeah.
and it's such
Mm-hmm.
an important life skill, whether you're writing an email or being, learning how to communicate or giving a speech or any of these things, like just learning how to organize your thoughts. That's so powerful. And I wanted to help figure out a way to make that more accessible, because I think that also helps kids find their voice, and ultimately learn how to communicate, how to advocate for themselves. And to me, that was all very much tied together. And so that's why I became really passionate about writing in particular.
Yeah. Well, that was I'm glad that you talked about the experience with just figuring out how to get kids into certain programs, because I think it's unfortunate that that happens, and I know that programs can't operate without funding, but I think you really need to consider how things are structured if you're turning students away, and it like, I mean, manipulating the numbers essentially. Like, it's I can think of other specific programs in reading that did that, to say like, hey, we're evidence-based, but they again only took certain students. And so it's like, well, yeah, if you do this program and you're doing it with students who didn't meet the criteria, and I think part of it is just I mean, it's marketing too. I mean, there's that as well. And I agree that there's not as much with writing as there is with reading. I actually had a conversation with Jan Wazowitz from Spell Links, who talks about language and the reading rope, and like that there it's not like it shouldn't just be the reading rope. There should be writing and thinking about literacy and writing in, like, not necessarily a writing rope, but like it should be all in one framework instead of just thinking about it separately. But I am glad that the science of reading is getting the media attention now, because unfortunately, even though there's a lot of research in reading, there's still a lot of people who are not teaching it in the way that we know works. So, um, but yeah, like I think we have to be having the conversation about writing, because as you said, there's like, I mean, I can just think of so many important life skills beyond academic work where you would need to be a good writer. So, and you gave a lot of good examples. So is there anything else that we haven't talked about so far that you think is like a just relating to writing intervention, and that you think would be good for people to know if they're thinking about how to support students? Even I really think about, I mean, I'm thinking about all grade levels, but particularly thinking about those students in secondary school who are still struggling, which I know is, probably a lot of what you're working with now. Like, what are some things that people should know about supporting those students?
I think it goes back to what we were saying of the power of chunking in small steps, like really to not underestimate the power of 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I think so many people just get overwhelmed when they hear writing, or you have to write a paper or a research paper. I mean, that can be in and of itself just like almost triggering. And if they've had a bad experience with writing, that's where their mind goes, and that's how they feel right away, like they shut down. And I think one thing I would want people to know, whether you're a teacher or a clinician or a parent, is if SRSD sounds like something you're interested in, and this is, I don't work for any SRSD, I'm not gaining anything from saying this. I just truly believe in the framework itself, and there lots of great resources on it, but you can totally start small and integrate like one aspect of this and see progress. And I think as you work with students and you're noticing, a lot of this maybe is like internal negative talk, then you can implement some of the strategies that we talked about with how to help with that and how to help visualize, short and long-term goals, and how to create those positive self-statements. And so I think the big takeaway is that you can start really small, and small steps matter and they add up, and little by little change happens.
So where can people go to? I have two questions. Where can people go to learn more about self-regulated strategy development? And then where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Sure. So think SRSD is the best source for all of this information. There are trainings, there are lots and lots of resources and examples. Another good place is it's called Iris. It's through Vanderbilt, and they have and I can give you the exact links and everything to share with everyone. But they also have a lot of like case studies too that are really helpful. They to kind of show you like here's how you would implement it with a student who might be struggling with these kinds of things. You can look up different topics, but SRSD is on there and really breaks down how to implement it. And then for me, I'm on social media on Instagram and TikTok at Learning with Dr. K. And then my website is Learning with Dr. K.
Great. Well, we'll link to all those things. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. It was great talking to you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the resources that were mentioned in this episode. And be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams using multiple service delivery models. So I show you how to do direct intervention, and I also show you how to coach and train others so that you can ensure students get support across their day. Remember that it helps me so much if you tell your friends and colleagues about De Facto Leaders, and if you follow me and leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether you listen on Apple or Spotify or another podcast network. And finally, if you're interested in collaborating with me, if you'd like to invite me to be on your podcast, if you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, or if you have a suggestion for a guest for De Facto Leaders, please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.